questions on administration, exam, other kinds of issues? We're now moving really partially with this session, but we're basically starting the second half of the course, and so we're trying to move more to. I'll lecture a little more today, but in general, we are continually in the second half more open to participation, questions, discussion of research projects, papers, DAs. And as we've covered the main big 5 areas of analysis already, if we've said in just one quick sort of extension, if you're thinking of a paper, and that is, a paper can also be a small field project, a review of a particular area of concern, that you could do either alone or with someone else, or 2 or 3 people. Some courses have class projects, and we've done that a few times in the past, and some people, if the students are interested in that specific topic, it's great. But we found that we have a lot of different kinds of interests, and they engage some people and others not, so we try to leave it more to you. But I'm simply saying, if some of you, 2, 3, 5, want to talk together about a particular topic, and we'd be happy to meet with you separately, discuss it here in the class context. That's what this second half of the course is open to doing, discussing some individual papers, some projects, or even a tentative project. Doesn't have to be a fixed project. You can say, what if we, and especially right now, we're just in the middle. If you can say, I'm interested in this, is there anybody else in the course who might like to join me on X? Or I'm interested in doing an ethnographic part of this, but I'd like to do some comparative work, but I don't know how to add up 2 and 3. And if someone wants to help with the quantitative part, raise your hand and let's talk. And then we can all, for instance, things of that sort are a common kind of discussion. So, anybody want to propose anything of that sort now? Okay, or if not in class, think about it. Those of you out there in California or wherever you may be, Houston, and we can explore them in the future. Okay. The reading section for today is the community power area. The main reading, there's several little things, but the main reading is Robert Dahl's book, Who Governs, which was not available when we first went over it, but now we're building up to the core themes in that book. Why now and why in this course, when some of these themes, some of these readings go back a number of years? I would say that maybe one of the most visible reasons is people coming from China maybe asking about what's the role of Marxism in explaining power and economic interrelations in the world today. Or people in the US or Canada or Western Europe may be saying the same, maybe using Marxism, literally and specifically, but more generally, many people use some of the terms: class conflict, capitalism, exploitation, hierarchy, maybe revolution, maybe not. But these themes are found in some of the schools we've identified of urban perspectives, as schools as maybe strong paradigms, identified with the biggest 3 cities. Remember, anybody remember the themes that link with, say, with capitalism and class conflict? Which of the 3 cities in which of the 3 cities do you find more emphasis on those kinds of conflictual neo-Marxist themes?
Was it New York?
Yes. The New York tradition, and there's a terrific video on this which I often use in other classes like political sociology, called Arguing the World. And used in more than one class here at the University of Chicago. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen on anything. It's not crude and simplistic. It deals with the core ideas by four people who were Marxists of slightly different stripes, mostly Trotskyites. They were not strong, fixed Stalinists, but they were all followers of Marx in the 1930s when they were growing up at the City College of New York. Then they went on to careers, and they changed in arguing the world, and arguing with McCarthy, and arguing with the Vietnam War, and arguing with student demonstrations in '68, and arguing. And so they themselves went in multiple different directions from Marxism, but Marx still influenced their thinking in visible, specific ways, which they articulate very subtly in the video. They influence the perspective of the New York urbanists, who, including today Sharon Zukin, Peter Dreyer, are explicitly avowed Stalinist. Dreyer 2 weeks ago had a posting said, I've been a lifelong Stalinist. And he mentioned Cuba and other places as informing his perspective on the world. So there's an interpenetration with some smart urban sociologists and others who are using these terms. The second are people like Bernard Sanders, who was a student here at the School of Social Service Administration, and who in the debates with Hillary Clinton kept more alive or reinvigorated, and you now have, I would say that's now continuing in the Democratic primary rhetoric more than was true 10 or 15 years ago. You get some of these kinds of terms being used in a fairly loose way. So I'm saying these ideological, labeling, conceptualizing kinds of terms are alive enough in the media, in political leaders, and on this campus in student discussions you hear, oh, she sold out to Wall Street. Okay, what does that mean? Or Trump is being impeached because, and then what are the components of clientelism or something else which are being specifically, that is Trump misusing, or how is his power being exercised in what specific negotiation or discussion in the Ukraine? These are now very big media and presidential impeachment issues. The terms power and influence are used loosely by the general media. Where have they been used best? The answer is in the literature I'm going to discuss today. And so these remain the core of the concept of power in the general media, in discussions of paradigm change in the history of science, in organization theory, in family discussions, family sociology, in science, in of course, national, international politics. Okay. So let's go over the key concepts. The background, again, in the late 19th century was Karl Marx. Marx dominated much of the policy discussion in ways that I just referred to in 19th century, probably more so in 19th century Germany, and the Germans then, I would say, were more explicit, more systematically and conceptually articulate in making these kinds of linkages. In this context, the main essay we start with is Max Weber's Class, Status, and Party. So the big argument which Weber was making, which he made in most of his work, that is, in a sense, most of Weber's general writings about where and why did capitalism, and narrowly termed or broadly, the economy, the political system, rationality, modern science, organizations of multinational corporations, these emerged in the West. They came out of the Industrial Revolution, which started in England. It did not start in Italy or more in China. That is, China had a 5,000-year civilization. China was way ahead of the West. Why didn't this happen first in China? Or India? India and China were much more advanced civilizations than the Europeans in the Middle Ages, when people were, killing each other in the way you saw in Macbeth. So what happened and why? And so there's a simple Marxist answer, or let's say a more simple Marxist answer, and Weber was really countering that and saying, but he was in background training an economic historian. He wanted to deal with these issues seriously, not in an ideological mode, but by doing more thorough, careful research, which others could check him on. And so he read tons of work on specialists in each of these areas of the world. So he started with, and his most famous essay was, which many of you read, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which made what argument? What's his argument there? Yes.
That some of the values that Protestant.
Yeah, you're Alex Prado? Nick Prado, go ahead.
No, Nick Villar.
Okay, go ahead. Nick.
I think, if I remember, is that
A little louder.
from what I remember, the main arguments are that the values instilled by Protestantism and Calvinism, specifically, are aligned with the values that allow for the development of capitalism as like a primary mode of production.
Okay. Yes, that's the core argument. But it's a to join those two things, to say that religion led to the development of capitalism, sounds like the opposite of what Marx was saying, and it is. So it was an intriguing, ironic kind of thing to advance. Did he say it's the simple cause and material factors don't matter? So you could say, here we have material factors, income, etc., and we have, say, Calvinism. Weber did not say ignore the material. He said we need both. And that's the core of his more generalizing essay, Capitalism, Socialism, and Politics, that if you have capitalism or economic development, then you can have class, status, and party really all operating here. So if we have material differences, the more affluent, the less affluent, being a sort of a quick, crude definition of class, then we can have status, which can be many, he didn't elaborate, but basically said status can include lots of things. It can be religion, it can be how good you are at singing, it can be how you tie your shoes, or how you play baseball, or all these things can potentially be a basis of status. But the point is, they are multiple. And so if you have once you move away from a one-factor model, you can easily say, well, sure, there are lots of things. There's one of the leading Frankfurt Marxists at the University of Chicago did a book who said class conflicts include smokers versus non-smokers. Those are two classes. So if you can say that, so Ralph Dahrendorf made this general argument as coming out of a Marxist background, that any conflict group can be a class. All right. So and after he said that, many people chose smokers, they chose cyclists, and so forth. So all right. So I'll call that other variables. And this is the revolution of Weber, basically. Multi-causality, probabilistic relationships rather than deterministic relations. That if probabilistic, that means you can have a little bit of several things. And so probabilism and multi-causality go together. All right. He also added that the Marxists stress production, whereas Weber said you can also have class conflict or conflicts over consumption, and cited the French Revolution. The people at the gates in Versailles were saying, "We need bread," and the famous repartee of Marie Antoinette, let them eat brioche, okay, was based not on production, but on what you consume. So, and you've heard me make this point multiple times. Most social scientists, most of the media still haven't gone beyond the 1789. Most people are still arguing production drives life. And I'm suggesting with more evidence now that consumption is also critical, and I'm citing here Max Weber said the same thing. Okay, so you can have status based on either production aspects or consumption aspects of life in many different issue areas. Okay. Weber generally had a huge impact over the 20th century on social scientists and on sort of intellectuals and in many related fields, history and so forth. However, there were some big ups and downs over the 20th century in terms of changing intellectual perspectives. And the simplest one to refer to is Robert and Helen Lynn did their famous book called Middletown, Muncie, Indiana, and it was a holistic, descriptive discussion of religion, ownership of the glass company, which was the big industry in town, and schools, high schools, where people live, which different neighborhoods. It was loose. Conceptually, it was loose methodologically, and it didn't give any sort of dominant view of power. Then the Depression came along, 1933, 29, 33, etc., and they did another book, Middletown in Transition. This was very different. In the meantime, he'd accepted a position, going to teach at Columbia. Columbia, in the New York perspective, combined with the Depression, led in Middletown in Transition to become neo-Marxists. And they had business leaders, the owners of the glass company, really dominated what was being done in the town. And so they had that kind of shift, and this was not just then. There was Warren Beatty did a film called Reds, based on people living in Greenwich Village, and Greenwich Village has been used for many things. Jane Jacobs for the opposite in a sense. Jane Jacobs stressed citizen participation. Warren Beatty and the others talked about the Stalinism and the Russians as a model for young radical Americans here, and it fits with this perspective in the book. And it fits with the background in the 1930s of arguing the world, as well as changes after the 1930s. The Ball Company, it was called, made canning jars, and this perspective of let's say business domination tended to continue through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and then in the course by Floyd Hunter that gave the field its name, community power structure, 1953. And he started writing, as he said later on, a serious, more scholarly statement of this, and he said, this is boring, nobody's going to read it, so he threw it out, and he said, I'm going to just write a more popular book. And that's what you have. It's loose, it's messy, it has internal contradictions, but its basic argument, he said later on as well, is Stalinist Marxist. Business domination. So he was loose and messy conceptually. What he did contribute that people built on and took more seriously was this kind of picture of who the leaders were. And this was linked with a methodology where you could ask person 12 and person 13, or so if we start with person 1. How might you begin? If you so people reading the book, and there were then 166 case studies that built on things sort of like this in 20 or 30 years afterward. He suggested, for instance, go to a political city hall reporter in the town and ask him who's important in the town. Write down their names. Go and interview them and ask them in turn who's important at the town. So if you interview Mr. Number 1, and number 1 says, it's Mr. 12, and Mr. 3 here says it's Mr. 12, and Mr. 4 says it's Mr. 12. So if Mr. 12 gets more votes in that sense, Mr. 12 is really the dominant, powerful leader in the town. And I'm simplifying a little, but the simple question was very crude. Who is important in Atlanta? And the idea of networks are here, and this kind of perspective on power continues loosely in some network analysis, but I'll just throw in one sentence for now and say that network analysis is not a theory, it's a method. It's a simple method like this, and it doesn't really tell you how or what the meaning is of a network. It doesn't tell you, if people say 12 is important, it doesn't tell you what important means, because you didn't even ask them. You didn't specify what important means. Okay, big issue. We'll continue with. In the field more generally, there were a couple of critics of Hunter. Sayre and Kaufman was one of the earlier examples of New York City, of basically saying that New York didn't look like this at all. That there were highly differentiated, different kinds of leaders in different fields, and so they didn't try to have an alternative, coherent theory or coherent methodology. They just said this doesn't work in New York. There were more descriptive accounts, but the big issue, the big transformation and debate in the field was when Robert Dahl published Who Governs in 1961. And so this is my one picture summary. That is, I'm giving you hints. We've got often one picture that tells you the key points. And in this area of community power, we got one a first column of the traditional elitists. C. Wright Mills, Pareto, Mosca, people who had a conception of, and I'll fill in over here a little bit, a general conception of what we can call base resources, money, high status, ethnic background, education, these base resources were assumed, especially in historical studies, and these Italians, many Italian names I mentioned, they're classic. I mean, Italians still today, they still talk and theorize about the Roman Empire. Why did the empire fall? What happened? Why aren't we still leading the world? Okay, and so the methodology has what's been called positional. If people were members of the Roman Parliament, what it was called, I've forgotten what it was called, or a city council, or a U.S. Congress, or a diet in Japan, if you were an elected official and you are there, or you are a president of a bank and you hold that position as president, or you are head of the Chamber of Commerce, those were the kinds of positions which identified power for this, from people writing from this perspective. The results were basically elites. The identity of was revealed. So in a sense, we're telling you the truth. We're revealing that, or more recently, to give a more recent example of this, say, X percentage of the city council or of the board of directors of the University of Chicago are men and white. Okay, those are more recent labels that people are saying. Therefore, we do not have the interests and concerns of non-whites and non-men represented. Okay, that's a more contemporary version of this kind of argument, but which is not basing on any concrete decision, but it's based on the social background of the people in those positions, their base resources. Okay, so Hunter came along, and Hunter also disagreed. He said that these people may have the right story of elites, but they don't tell us anything there because we don't know what the people did. And so Hunter said, let's do it this way. So I shouldn't say did. Hunter didn't say that way. So Hunter basically said, we want to focus on power. And power, I'll come back to a definition a little bit later, but the key operational concept of power for Hunter was what people have later on called the reputational, or the reputational method, reputation. This methodology has later been called reputational because it's the reputation Mr. 12 has in the minds or in the votes of the other people. And the elite, again, elites and especially business and some professionals. The point was governments are largely left out of these first two, especially in U.S. discussions. Dahl, okay, 1953. Dahl, 1961. Who governs? Okay, Dahl said everything that went on before is wrong, or is misconceived, it's too simple. Instead of talking about power in simple terms, we should talk about influence. And the method, okay, but let's elaborate this box here. This is a critical point which shifts the rest of the paradigm. What did he mean when he said it only has influence? He also used the term resources. Who can elaborate a little bit on the implications of that based on reading Dahl or whatever else? What's a resource? Just for anybody can get yes.
It's like something that helps you get other people to do something.
Yes, like having a lot of money or being high in status, but the key point that Dahl is using here in saying resource is saying, like money, you can spend it if you want to, but if you don't spend it, you have an extra. But he then Dahl went further and said, you have an exercised power. You've only got the resource. So if Bill Gates may be number one, number two, Warren Buffett, Amazon, these may be the number 1, 2, 3 richest people in the world. But if they don't live in Muncie, Indiana, or they don't live in Chicago, and or in their own hometown, if they say they're not going to spend their money on local politics, they're going to spend their money on international advertising or on attacking the other corporations, they may have zero influence in that particular. Okay, so now we're introducing interrelated concepts. Issue area. In different issue areas, you can choose to use your resources or not. And local politics is one general arena. But within it, you can then have, remember Peterson. What did Peterson talk about? 3 kinds of issue areas. Allocational, redistributive, economic development were 3 areas of policy. And Peterson, following Dahl and others, basically said, there's an economist named Musgrave who used and then Ted Lowe used these same 3 types before Peterson did. Basically, these different issue areas are isomorphic with they tend to lead to a particular style of leadership. So economic development, the argument was, tends to lead to more business leadership, because businesses are more concerned with business development. However, businesses are much less concerned with the allocation of police services in one neighborhood versus another neighborhood, or fire department location, or parks, or park programs. Those are individual citizen participatory kinds of issues, and we would expect more bottom-up policy making in those arenas. Whereas in the third, redistribution, Peterson's argument is local governments just can't do it. And if they try to destroy themselves, like San Francisco, when we talked about the homeless, therefore local government shouldn't try, and redistribution should be the province of the national government. Okay, so that's the Peterson argument, but I'm bringing it back to stress. Issue areas are a critical concept, and Hunter did not say anything about them. Hunter only said who's important in Atlanta, ignoring issue specificity. Yeah.
So with the idea that resources only have influence on the issue area that they're actually being applied in, isn't it reasonable to assume that having resources can in and of itself kind of give you influence in an area, even if you're not exercising it at all? Like for example, if Omaha, Nebraska try to issue an estate tax to Warren Buffett, it seems like it's reasonable that it would automatically be influenced down because he's just there.
Warren Buffett's a good example in the sense that he has often in the past, especially with Democratic presidents, he was asked to consult many times, and he made many statements and promoted many policies which were taxing the rich more. For instance, on Social Security, he said we shouldn't give Social Security to everybody who's rich, where the government's just wasting money, throwing it away by giving rich people Social Security. We ought to save Social Security for poor people. And so there are many things where Warren Buffett did not take personally did not take a simple rich business kind of perspective. So I'd say in that sense, you make right in your first sentence that is, you put 2 things together, which Dahl and I'm trying to separate. One is a resource is the key point is a resource is a potential. It may not be used at all, or if you just keep your money in the bank, or using money as an example, or it may be used to try to influence all aspects of city politics. It may be that some people, some business people, for instance, some rich people may not know about these kinds of issue area differences, especially, say, in a very small town. And so just, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. We went to Yugoslavia. Bill Kornblum and I went to, he was a PhD student here. We worked with 2 Yugoslavs. We spent the summer trying to see how much are these things specific to capitalism or the West, and how do they differ under a communist system. So we went there before the Berlin Wall was down. We went there under, it was open enough that we could ask questions, but it was tough enough that it was clearly a regular communist system. And we studied 2 towns. One was a differentiated. I mean, I'm getting a little ahead of the story, but I'm answering your question. That is, one was an economically differentiated town. People doing different kinds of things, different kinds of jobs, different kinds of industries, different sorts of professionals, etc. And they had, so there were many issue areas, and there were many levels of participation that differed. There wasn't any one story. The second town had one industry. It was a mine. And we interviewed for 4 months, went around, talked to all kinds of people day by day, and got a sense of who was making the critical decisions. And our issue area was housing. But within housing, there were 4 kinds of policies. You could have housing that was owned by the city government, housing that people owned themselves. They just built their own homes and owned them, because housing that was owned by the corporation, if there was a corporate, a big firm, or things that might be cooperative in some way. So over the summer, we kept interviewing, and then we finally got to the head of the corporation, who was also the chairman of the housing committee of the city council, and was also considered the most important business person in the town. And we then asked him, what kind of housing do you prefer? He said, corporate housing, because if a worker steps out of line, I want to not only fire him from his job, I want him to know that I'll kick him out of his house. Okay, that's visible, explicit policy position. Very seldom do you get something nice and clear and specific. Warren Buffett has never said anything like that. He says the opposite. That is, and I'm not saying Warren Buffett's lying. I'm saying Warren Buffett is smart enough to, or I wouldn't say smart enough. Warren Buffett has multiple issues, has many views on many policies within finance, within business, within his investments, as well as within politics and public policy, which don't fit any standard kind of perspective. So I'm contrasting the 2, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of my story, but I'm bringing it in to help you explicitly differentiate between using resources at all and using them in a specific issue area. So if you were living in the town where that tough business leader was there, and you wanted to say, if you're working with him, you could say, okay, yes, I'll give him more money if he wants to get he wasn't the mayor. He could have run for mayor. You could say, I want to back him for mayor, or I want to do anything that I do in this town may all fit into one kind of policy arena, which is helping this guy do what he's doing already. And making this corporation do well. So alternatively, if you want to challenge him, say you want to start something else in that town, okay, and small. Okay, let me push on and finish my couple of other columns, and then we can come back and have more general discussion. So we're introducing some core concepts of DAO and the implications of these for other columns in this box. We mentioned resources, issue areas. Third big related concept is pyramid. If you have, let's say, 2 kinds of resources here, and you have a third, you can build a little pyramid by stacking up resources, such as if one person has support of the Italian Americans in one neighborhood, and another person has the support of the Poles, and you have strong ethnic politics, and another person is the editor of the newspaper, and he's neither Polish nor Italian, the three of them might get together and say, let's attack the current mayor and come out with a new alternative. And if we stick together, and the Italians, the Poles, and the newspaper all attack it, we may be able to win through pyramiding by using our complementary resources. Okay, that's the idea of pyramiding. But what you see in the example is also agency, that someone is saying, let's get together. I mean, it can be explicit agency actively saying, let's coordinate our efforts, or it could be more almost by chance. It may be that somehow these three separate groups simply end up taking the same position based on a variety of things which are not explicitly coalition building. Okay, so pyramiding, issue areas, resources. Another one is slack. If this is a major point. What proportion of people in the U.S. vote in local elections, or vote in national elections? Maybe 50%, 40% in national elections, maybe 25% in local elections. So 75% of the people roughly just don't vote. However, when you have conflicts such as a threatened or a potential racial transition in Chicago or Gary or Cleveland, where you've got a lot of racial sensitivity, ethnic conflict from the past, when there's been a critical election, such as the first election of a black mayor in Detroit, Chicago, or Gary, the turnout has gone up to 80%, 90%. So you can have, the slack has gone way down, but the point is, that slack is there, and that slack, or the degree to which that slack is mobilized through pyramiding and other things, is a critical factor. So it's not just do you support the mayor or not, the question is, are you going to vote? And so Hillary Clinton had a clear majority in the polls. All the pollsters said Hillary Clinton's going to beat Trump. Practically nobody predicted that Donald Trump was going to win the election based on the poll. But they didn't turn out and vote. And it wasn't so much that the voters did not turn out for Trump. The big surprise was the degree of decline that many Hillary Clinton supporters did not vote. And so many interpreters then have said she got called, corrupt. She sold out to Wall Street. She was weak. She fainted. I mean, other factors which may have led her to be less charismatic than she had been earlier on, as well as, I would add, especially in the primary. That is not just with Trump, but in the primary, Bernie Sanders really hit her very, very hard on Wall Street, on corruption, et cetera, and weakened her legitimacy or potential support there. Okay, so the and I'm going from local to national to, that is, we could find the same thing within office politics. I worked in City Hall in Chicago for a while on a number of issues. And if you're working in some offices in the days when Daley and Jane Byrne and Harold Washington when Harold Washington was mayor, and you still had people working in the same office who were not political or organizers. These were, people in the Department of Inspections. I mean, any office in City Hall was divided into these three groups. If you wanted a paperclip, you asked someone who was not from one of your, if you were a Harold Washington supporter and you asked a Jane Byrne supporter for a paperclip, they said, no, I don't have any paperclips. Because they wouldn't help each other on anything in managing a bureaucratic office because of the political disconnections among them. Okay, so you can have politicization affect an office politics, or it may be over, do you like the gender policy of the president, the president of the corporation, or the head of our division, or do you like his position on fandom in sports? Is he a backer of the Cubs or not? Okay, so yeah. Have you had any? Do you have an example of how sports might influence politics in that way? Okay, we have an expert on fandom here.
Politics, not quite. But I had an interesting conversation with a guy who is a Cubs fan, but also a Packers fan, and those two don't really equate because the Packers and the Bears are massive rivals. So he, I guess, gave me like a couple examples of weird interactions that he's had at Cubs games with things like that.
Okay. So, different issue. Yeah. Question.
I was just gonna say, couldn't you say that in a lot of ways, whether people choose to support the White Sox versus the Cubs, like, could be politicized?
Sure. No, for sure.
As an example.
I mean,
With the sports.
that is, you can say that fandom is politicized in the sense that sports is politics.
Yeah.
Yeah, not that it's Democratic or Republican or
No.
something. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I would go further. I mean, some people say, well, you know, White Sox is black South Side, Cubs is North Side white, so it's racist. Okay, etc. I say that as a Bronzeville resident, where we get a lot of flack for either using or not using, and Bronzeville residents are divided about 50-50 on that issue. Okay. Slack, pyramiding, resources, issue areas. Write down these concepts. These are big and important. They were introduced by Dahl. They transformed the whole field of thinking about how power works. And they undercut much of the earlier work in showing how it was based on tenuous assumptions. Even though Dahl, in his earlier section, in the historical section of the Who Governs book, used the positional method to talk about the history of New Haven leadership and how it moved away from the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to the new immigrants, and then to battles among them and so forth. Okay, let me finish filling in just these columns briefly. The method, what was Dahl's method? How did Dahl study people in ways that were different from what had gone in these first two columns? He used what he called the decisional method. We don't want to study reputation. We don't want to just study holding an office. We want to say, what did people actually do? And it's the idea related to resources. If you've got a lot of money in your pocket and you don't spend it, then you're not exercising any influence. And so he then focused on 3 issue areas: the mayoral election, schools, and economic development, and found very big differences in terms of who participated. So you had parents and the PTA and so forth for schools. You had business leaders, banks, real estate people in the development area, and in the mayoral election you had the parties and the neighborhood groups and some ethnic groups. Who was a general leader, the way I talked about the Yugoslav general leader? The mayor. A handful of people around the mayor. That is, in that sense, New Haven, as studied by Dahl using this methodology, generated a very different set of results from the story we saw in Atlanta, of concentration on business leadership on a handful of people. Did Dahl have a sense? Okay, so let me just leave it there for a minute. Go on to then the results. Pluralism is the label that Dahl used, that there are a plurality of actors that are important, and that it depends on the issue area, it depends on their specific interest in mobilization, and that degree of slack can change depending on the dynamics in a particular issue area, such as a recession or mobilization for a first black mayor and so forth. But the big point is political leadership could be particularly critical in crossing over these, in a sense, these Venn diagrams, these Budweiser beer symbols, and transforming the way things work. Okay. After Dahl, we then had people who began to criticize him and say, well, what did you do wrong, Dahl? And that dyadic relationship is the core definition of power. The second concept is anticipated reactions. Illustrated, if B anticipates that maybe A might do something, he will act differently, and so he tries to get a sense, what does A want, even though if he may have never have said what he wants or she wants. The third idea is direct versus indirect influence, that person C may be here, person C may influence both A and both B. And C may be either a person or it may be a change, say, in the economy or in a political invasion. That is, C may be some other factor that changes both of them. So in that sense, it's bigger than a dyadic relationship. Fourth dimension is reciprocity. That in this definition, power is described as an asymmetrical interpersonal relationship. This calls attention to the fact that even if A influences B, B may also influence A. So many political leaders, in Anthony Downs' model of the ideal political leader, is that he will go around, he'll do the polls, he'll talk to people, or Ed Koch in the subway would say, how am I doing? How am I doing? And then, based on a feel for what citizens want in different neighborhoods or in the city and more generally, he will anticipate, and then he will say, here's my program. Okay. Edward Banfield's book, Political Influence, really argued that Mayor Daley I, from 1955 onward, governed Chicago in that way. So Banfield was a smart political scientist here. He disagreed with Mike Royko, who did most of the literature on Chicago on the Daily say they were bosses. They were tough. They got what they wanted. The machine beat everybody else down. They were racist, etc., etc. And Banfield basically said the opposite. He said, Daley I looked for battles going on in neighborhoods. He looked for who the winner was, and when the winner was almost there, he'd reach over and said, this is my position. So he'd hold up the hand of the winner and say, this is my position on this neighborhood. And people said, Daley always wins. He didn't win. He just joined the winner in the last round. This was Banfield's general argument. That's a showing much more sensitivity to how influence works. And especially as we get further historically from Daily One and people can't interview anymore, you get more and more amazing, I would say, especially, there's a new literature on racism. There's a racist reinterpretation of Chicago politics, which was not there to that degree at all in the past, and it's exaggerated. That is, it's simplified is the problem. Point 5 is action versus inaction. Okay, here the big, this is more tricky. And the concept which was introduced by Bachrach and Barretts was you can have non-decisions and you can have negative decisions. A non-decision is simply, should we have a communist revolution in Chicago this week or not? And if we don't have a communist revolution and we're still doing the same thing, that's a non-decision. Okay, so some interpreters will say capitalism is dominating the Chicago City Council because they haven't had a communist revolution. You can see it. Okay, that's a non-decision, and that's the definition of Bachrach and Barretts and why they say, capitalism dominates. But Bachrach and Barretts were smart enough that they also said there can be negative decisions. If you put up to the Chicago City Council, shall we have a vote that we want to revolutionize and we want to, and under Harold Washington, the Commissioner of Economic Development came to my class and I asked him, what do you want to do about the steel problem? So you got a huge problem of the whole steel industry is going down. It's one of the biggest bases in Chicago, etc. Neighborhoods are being devastated. What is your policy? And he said, my personal policy is we want to nationalize the whole steel industry and take it over the way they do in Russia. However, I know that won't work with the bankers, and Harold Washington wouldn't go along with me. But that is within the Harold Washington administration. You had him, who, and he was not alone. You had some people who said this kind of thing. And there were many discussions and votes in the Harold Washington administration between the backers of Washington and the two Eddies, Fast Eddie Verdoliak and Eddie Burke, and they had the majority of the votes. So you could see negative decisions. So for instance, when Harold Washington introduced the first program budget ever used in the city of Chicago, Fast Eddie Verdoliak held it up and said, "This ain't no budget." And he, clientelist politician that he was, wanted to see the names and the specific line items of individual departments where he could place his supporters. He wanted to know if his supporters and his agencies were having their budgets cut or not. And in program budgeting, you have something like street cleaning, but you don't say how many people are truck drivers. And so so if you want to read truck drivers are being cut, you can't see it. So what this illustrates, this conflict illustrates, are conceptions not only of power, but of the type of the process of decision making. It reflects a clientelism process and focus of a clientelist leader, Verdoliak, who wanted to give jobs to his supporters, and he did not care about the issue, the general issue of are the streets cleaner or not. Whereas the idea of program budgeting is we want to make the streets clean. We want the policy output to be the focus, not the mechanism of how many truck drivers there are and how much is contracted out or done within the city government. Okay, so decision, non-decision, action, inaction. Pages on that one. Legitimacy. Since Max Weber, what's legitimacy? Did Weber talk about types of legitimacy? Okay. Yes. Weber said you want to be a leader and you want people to really support you, you need to have their hearts and minds engaged behind you as well. And that can be done, and so he then looked around empirically, did a lot of work, and then he talked about bureaucratic, legal, charismatic, what was the third type? Sociology PhD student.
Democracy, charisma.
Okay.
I can't remember the third even.
Traditional.
Traditional.
Yeah, that's right.
Tradition.
Yeah. Good job.
Chinese. Okay. We did it last year the same way. We'll do it in the future. Okay. The point of legitimacy is that it's a relationship between the leader and the citizens. If the citizens don't feel what you're doing is legitimate, you are illegitimate. And so, but there are three different ways that he distinguished, and we, in our later scenes book, we've added a couple of others, like egalitarianism, which is far more important, and other things like localism, which have grown more visibly important than when Weber wrote about this. So there are many ways, in a sense, ways that you can build legitimacy by having citizens behind you. And so these are three to begin with, but the general idea is the leader in sync with the citizens? That's the idea of, and if you are, then you're a legitimate leader. Then it can be the leader's social, and this can be based on the leader's social background and style. So at Daly, the two Dalys wore the same kinds of suits. They had the same kind of hairstyle. They had the same kind of what I've also called Chicago Public School English. That is, they talked, they wrote the same way. People said Daly too is the same as his father, and Chicago Magazine, had said this all the time. It makes the same grammatical errors as his father. Obviously, he's just doing the same kind of politics. My interpretation is that's wrong. He was the son of Harold Washington more than the son of his own father politically. The machine did not back him. He had to fight his way up against the machine. The machine was Eddie Doliak and other people. Publicly, Daly, too, was a strong reformer, continued more by Tony Preckwinkle, Harold Washington, Rahm Emanuel, and Mary Lightfoot. Now, they are stronger and stronger reformers in that sense. Daly, one privately, nevertheless continued some of the old clientelist policies, but he, unlike his father when he was attacked, why'd you give those jobs to your son's insurance firm? His father said it's a father's duty to help his sons. Daly, too, would never have said that. Daly, too, agreed with Harold Washington and said clientelism is immoral, wrong, illegal, and any person caught taking bribes will go to jail, and I'll back the federal government or others attacking it. Okay, legitimation. Number 8, number of participants in the decision. If that is, you can have one person making a decision alone, or you can have a committee, you can have a board advisors, or you can have lots of people in the streets demonstrating, shouting, cheering or opposing on both sides. So in Seoul right now, in the last recent years in Seoul, you have people demonstrating in favor of LGBT gay rights, and others, especially the evangelical churches, are demonstrating against them. Outside the White House, this has often been the case since the 60s onward. This kind of Latin scene has come to the West, and you have street politics increasingly important. Hong Kong today. So the number of participants in decisions transforms the kinds of processes that go ahead and tends to mobilize citizens visibly, and if they have the backing of support of, initially it used to be a narrowly controlled setting, that is, initially television was one state station in most of Western Europe or China, or there was only one state station. Then BBC and so forth. Then you get to one or two more. Then you can get to the internet. So now, people take a video of how the police treated one poor black citizen and shot him, and the video then gets posted on the internet, then gets posted and shown on television. That in turn can destroy a political leader like Rahm Emanuel. So Rahm Emanuel did not run for a third term, probably in good part because of mishandling that kind of situation. Okay. Too simple, but one important factor. Patterns of value distribution. Patterns of value distribution. That's what I'm getting to here. That is, if you have, say, cities divided in Chicago's classically divided in terms of ethnicity. Blacks versus Poles versus Irish versus Italians, etc. Others may be divided based on smoking. Others may be divided based on, do you work for the Pullman company or not. So others may be based on length of time in the town. In Yankee City, studied by Warner, you couldn't be an upper status person unless you'd lived in Yankee City for multiple generations, ideally since the founding of the town, and that was reenacted every 4th of July in the parade. And who did the parade? Okay, so patterns of value distribution now grow, I'm suggesting, increasingly important as citizens have grown increasingly important, especially since 1968 and 1989 around the world. And these changes have been so big and so powerful that many political leaders have not changed fast enough themselves, and they have either been impeached or voted out of office, and similar kinds of things. I'm going to stop there so we can have some discussion, and we'll continue a little bit with some of these points next time. But let me stop and have a little more general discussion. I've covered a lot of things, big and complicated concepts, sometimes rapidly, trying to give you an example, more current of them, but these are fundamental points. Yes?
Quick question about the Dahl reading. So Dahl talks a fair amount at the end about skill, about political skill that professionals can use to kind of help sway others. Could that be considered a resource itself?
Sure, absolutely. Dahl has a list of 13, 14 resources, such as professional skills, such as the media, the leadership, and in the old days it could be just the newspaper, but now we've got internet. That's a major thing which has changed just in 20, 30 years, is the internet has drastically decentralized, quote, control of the media, have become internet sites. You can create your own website, you can create your own fandom, and some people do it full time, and they become serious leaders of this, selling clothes, selling sports ideas, and so forth. But many others, Facebook likes can be analyzed like the popularity of Hunter. But would you say that those people are controlling everything in your life because you said you chose them as a friend? Probably not. Although there's some. I've had several students do BAs on things like fandom. And you've got some movie stars or sort of especially charismatic women who when they see, and they may have millions of followers and friends, when they see someone posting saying, I'm having a problem with this, my boyfriend wants to do that, wants to go to California, and I want to go to Canada. I mean, she sometimes will some of them will then will send a response like the old Dear Abby that is, what do you do when your boyfriend wants to do something different? She will, I understand your problem. I was in the same situation myself, and I suggest that you find a compromise. Okay, so you have, and so several of the fandom studies that I've read is that younger people in the U.S. are articulating more of an age conflict with their own parents, and they turn to the media for someone who is more in touch with some of their, and this was especially true after, say, 1968. With the rise of counterculture, parents would change less than some of the kids sometimes, and so you would have that kind of conflict. And so the fandom can be a phenomenon which is not just bottom up, which is also heightened, and so you can have a surrogate mother in that sense, being the movie actress who also may articulate a more slightly transgressive or some other perspective than does the more strict middle class mother. Okay, so that's an example of, I mean, a very crude, simple, but widespread example of a lot of the fandom kinds of issues. But illustrating reciprocity, interaction, the complexities of these things, and how it's not clear, and that is, so even if Madonna sends me a note which says, you ought to do this, I don't necessarily have to follow what Madonna tells me to do. So she does, and she doesn't know. Nobody knows. Okay. So these are complicated. Is a big part of that. That is, they're more pluralistic than the simplistic kind of. And especially if you use things like classism, racism, loose terms, or capitalism, these kinds of things are so loose in general that there may be 200 intervening variables. It may be that, yes, capitalism is there, racism is there, classism is there for sure. But the question is, how strong are those causal arrows, and how many other intervening links are there compared to other factors also at work? Other comments, questions, examples you can try to interpret that may be difficult. Yes?
So I think one example with the sports and politics kind of coming together is with stadiums. Where
Yes.
the local politics essentially has been for
Absolutely. Absolutely. I started to get to this. I may have briefly touched on it earlier, but let me just bring it back again as it's linked here. How much the Cubs area has a line of what's the name of the street? Just it's not Milwaukee. It's not Halstead. Anyway, I've forgotten the name of the street. There's a horizontal, mostly a north-south line of maybe for 8-10 blocks, filled with bars and some restaurants, which are very Cubs oriented. And so people say, look, the Cubs stadium had a big economic impact on this neighborhood. Larry Bennett is a professor in Chicago, and he did a book which said this. Okay. How do you do a cost-benefit analysis? So economists are called in, or some kinds of, and most Chicago economists in that context will say, you cannot do a cost-benefit analysis of one case in isolation like that. All you can do is guess and use messy guesstimates, and I wouldn't, and most of them won't do it. However, there's some people who do it, some economists who do, or they're also called economic consultants or marketing development, whatever. And so they will then try to say how much impact is there on, that is, how many dollars, what's the elasticity or the leveraging of the Cubs stadium, and if you have more people going to the baseball games, how much is that increasing the revenues of the bars? And how many more bars will you have built? Okay. The main criticism of that is the same as what you can see here. And also I mentioned earlier the concept of the extent of the market from Adam Smith, or globalization, Sassi. And if we take not just the revenues paid by the Cubs Corporation to the players, and not just the profits taken by the owner, but you've got fees. That is, they get money from advertising, and they can have advertisements in the stadium which show when the television screens are on the players. You can see, Budweiser beer, other things in the background. But bigger than that, you have people then saying, we want to show the baseball game in China because we want the Chinese to see how the Chicago Cubs are playing against another team, and we'd like to get the rights to show these. That's where the big money is. So the size of the Chinese market is a big factor in the Chicago Cubs and the White Sox and American baseball. And when the first there was a huge Chinese basketball player who was hired by one of the NBA teams about 10 years ago. When he played his first game, there were I think 3 times as many people in China watching that first game as the entire American population. So the size of the Chinese market is so big that looking at one little street and talking about economic effects is silly. Okay, so that also says, but how big is, so we're talking here more narrowly economic than political, but I'm doing it deliberately because the analogous set of processes and decisions go on in the economy or in a political decision or in a family or in a church. You can have a hierarchical church or you can have a very egalitarian church. All right, we're at the end of the hour. We will continue with these issues. If you haven't looked at, spend a little time with Robert Dahl, especially. He's the #1 reading. He's not relisted here because he's earlier on in the list, but these are the big concepts. He presents them quickly. He doesn't really elaborate them in as much detail, but take a look. That's where they come from. Okay.